Chairman Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, a means of purging the bourgeoisie, the capitalist, and the traditional elements of Chinese society. Whilst the Cultural Revolution had a dramatic and disturbing effect on Chinese society, in today's video we will be looking at just one of its impacts on one region of China, the Guangxi Massacre. This particular massacre was noted for extreme cases of cannibalism, not done for desperate survival, but for a twisted display of power over the dead. It is thought that some 100 to 150,000 people were massacred over a 9-year period, killed as civil war raged against the backdrop of the Cultural Revolution. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief description of the Cultural Revolution. To put it simply, the revolution was the mechanism whereby Chairman Mao could reassert control over the Communist Party. The failures of Mao's Great Leap Forward had led him to being sidelined by the party. But with the Cultural Revolution, Mao sought to energize mass support for him as a means to deal with the elements within the Communist Party who wished to take the country in a different direction. The revolution was framed as a way to remove the bourgeoisie that had managed to sneak into the party and corrupt the communist goals. The Red Guards, a paramilitary of students loyal to Mao's vision, soon began forming around the country after Mao had publicly supported one such group of students. Museums, books, art, and all of the graves of the old Chinese leaders were all targeted and destroyed by such groups. The goal was to purge these works and ideas from the consciousness of the Chinese communists, so that the country could grow anew, unshackled from its past. It also proved to be a useful tool of oppression against Mao's enemies. Many would be called the bourgeoisie for their clothes, their job, or even their views. Landlords and wealthy farmers were often the targets of the Red Guard. Those suspected of leaning into their capitalist or counter-revolutionary mindset would be targeted and massacred. Eventually, the police were forbidden from intervening in the Red Guard's violence, which would be termed as a struggle. The lynching and murder of teachers, intellectuals, and anyone considered a political enemy of Mao would be all too common. Examples of this violence and the extremes it can lead to can best be seen in the Guangxi Massacre. The Guangxi region had been led by Wei Guoqing since 1954. When the Cultural Revolution spread through the region in 1967, it would be the setting for some of the worst violence of the period. After so long in power, one of Wei's political opponents, Wu Qinan, sought to use the emerging Red Guard as a means to take control of the region. The two factions would come to be known as the Alliance Command, otherwise known as the Big Faction. This command was led by Wei, and the other faction was known as the Small Faction, led by Wu. Militias were formed with each side vying for control. The Big Faction, however, had the backing of the local military units. Skirmishes between the two sides escalated, with the failing Small Faction resorting to hijacking arms shipments designated for the Vietnam War to try and gain some parity in their weaponry. This escalation did result in Mao lending his support to the Big Faction, followed by a stern declaration that any further rebellious actions would be severely punished. In the end, Wei was able to gain control of the region, but what followed was a reign of terror where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. It was during the massacre of these counter-revolutionaries that matters escalated even further, to the point where cannibalism was used as a tool of terror and a test of loyalty. In Wushuan County, January of 1968, the fighting between the big and small factions played out as one might expect, with small skirmishes escalating to the point where deaths were becoming ever more common. In April of 1968, a new revolutionary council was formed as a means to bridge the divide between the factions. However, the prominent, decent roles were to be held by members of the Big Faction, who were very much eager to destroy the Small Faction once and for all. In May of 1968, a series of coordinated attacks were launched against the Small Faction's strongholds, leading to a rout of the defeated Small Faction members. It was during the following 6 weeks that cannibalism was employed against the defeated rebels. As hundreds of leading rebels were summarily executed, many of the bodies were cannibalized. Much of the evidence for this comes from an official report into the Guangxi massacres. These reports were carried out by the Chinese government in the 1980s. In addition, there is the research of the Chinese dissident author Chang Yi, as published in his book The Scarlet Memorial. A 1987 report details how 64 of the victims were cannibalized, 56 had their heart and liver removed, consumed apparently to offer a medicinal benefit. Of the 64, 18 were completely consumed, 13 had their genitals removed and eaten, and 1 was decapitated. It is understood that 7 of the victims had parts of their body removed and were consumed whilst they were still alive. The reasons for the cannibalism seems to have been twofold. Firstly, it acted as a test of loyalty. Plenty of those who took part in the cannibalism were local party leadership, not just the cultural revolutionaries. It would often be the case that multiple people would engage in the cannibalism of one person. Hearts and livers seem to have been favoured, similar to how the belief amongst some Chinese cultures that consuming animal parts will confer some benefit. In one particularly grim example, some 70 students murdered and cannibalized one of their teachers. The students showed their loyalty by consuming the flesh in the presence of the leading members of the Revolutionary Council. And secondly, it appeared to have been a symbolic and culturally significant act of vanquishing the enemy. There are examples of the defeated small faction members being dismembered and flayed, a practice similar to the torture of Ling Qi. Such a process would mean the body is not whole, something vital in the Confucian philosophy, and something that was to be dismissed by the Cultural Revolution. A theatrical and public display of dismemberment of a small faction leader named Zhao Weiyan was carried out, with his pregnant wife being asked, "Is this your husband's thigh? Is this your husband's head? Was he a bad person?" At a time of chaotic revolutionary and extreme violence, cannibalism was the next step in the actions taken to completely eviscerate the enemy, but it was done in a way to make a show of rejecting the old norms and accepting the new. And yet, their cannibalism echoed many of the old Chinese myth of many vanquished foes consumed by the victors. There are instances of so-called flesh banquets, where loyalty, ritual, and fear were used to great effect. One key reason for these banquets taking place would be a way to distribute culpability, leaving it not just with those who were carrying out the executions. Communal responsibility was enforced, meaning any subsequent investigations that may be carried out would result in people unwilling to incriminate themselves. For example, in Binyang County, each family was required to provide one person to engage in such acts, as a means to bind all to complicity. As an interesting yet disturbing aside, only one of the victims of cannibalism as listed in the official report was a woman. The report highlights how one teacher consumed the flesh of a beautiful female student for medicinal purposes. For eating the woman, he was considered as mad by the others who had engaged in cannibalism. Male flesh was seen as to offer the most benefit, whilst female flesh was seen as inedible, as it would not confer any virality or power to the consumer. In some instances, the backdrop of the violence was used to settle grievances. One example that is mentioned in the official report is that of one branch of a family massacring another branch. Using the political power afforded to them as being members of the militia, the Plumtree branch of the Li family carried out serious essay against women of the Pear Tree Li branch. This was then followed up with the men of the Pear Tree branch being round up in rope and taken to the market as if they were cattle. There, the men were beaten to death, dissected, and had their genitals and livers removed. Their remains were then dumped into a nearby river. The Pear Tree women were then forcibly married off, and all property was stolen by the Plumtrees. Most of the violence would not only be carried out against those suspected of crimes, but it was also carried out most earnestly by those suspected of such crimes too, as a means to prove oneself loyal to those carrying out the Cultural Revolution. Those on the cusp of the bourgeoisie or supposedly counter-revolutionary behaviours would enthusiastically engage in the violence, fearful that they might end up on the receiving end of the militias. So too did younger people in their teens carrying out violence in an enthusiastic manner. One example was an 18-year-old woman who gained a level of infamy for her passionate engagement with violence. She was noted for favouring cutting off the genitals of her male victims. with these acts catapulting her to the position of deputy head of the Revolutionary Council for her entire county. It should be restated that the cannibalism was limited to just 6 weeks and that most victims were not cannibalized. Most of the victims were subjected to group beatings, disembowelments, beheadings, and all manner of other execution methods. In Guangxi, the official reports estimate that around 100,000 people were massacred during the Cultural Revolution, though other estimates place the death toll as high as 200,000 or even more. In 1968, Mao ordered his Red Guards to stop the violence and instead focus on labor in the countryside. The idea was to allow the young members to experience life in rural China, and this largely redirected the energies of the groups and averted much of the widespread violence. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao sought to polarize good and bad morality under an overarching accepted morality. Such a position was not to be questioned. The difficulty was that the definitions of the enemy was not uniform and would vary from region to region, and so too would the form of execution and rejection of the enemy. In some areas, the victims of the Cultural Revolution would be burned alive, whilst others, they would be beaten to death slowly by large groups of people. In Guangxi, a remote, poor, and rural area, grievances were played out and tens of thousands massacred, but the fact that the violence descended into cannibalism was not unique. There were reportedly 2 other regions, southern Henan and western Henan. It's believed that cannibalism took place in these regions too, although no official report appears to have been produced, and so information on the matter is lacking. But against the backdrop of a civil war, and with the insistence from the communist leadership in Beijing, the act of destroying the enemy of the people allowed even the most extreme acts seem justifiable.